Late at night, have you ever felt someone standing right behind you, even when you know you're completely alone? 300 years ago, a group of physicians from the Habsburg Empire felt that same presence. They stood around a corpse, freshly dug from its grave, and when they drove a stake into its chest, bright red blood sprayed out, and the corpse groaned. Not a rumor, not a folktale, a documented event in an official medical report. So how did something like this end up in the scientific papers of the Enlightenment? The answer isn't in Transylvania. It lies buried under 4,000 years of human fear. Tonight, we trace the shadow of the blood-drinking monster from Mesopotamian deserts to Egypt, Greece, China, the Vikings, all the way to the real investigation that gave the world the word vampire. The first stories of the undead were not written in books, but carved into the fears of ancient civilizations. Long before the word vampire existed, the world was already haunted by mythic archetypes, shaped by ancient beliefs and the echoes of ancestral spirits. Across deserts, mountains, and forgotten graveyards, early societies tried to explain the unexplainable through historical folklore, through shadows that moved in the night and bodies that refused to stay still. These were haunting origin stories, fragments of lost and forgotten history, preserved only through whispered warnings and forgotten rituals meant to keep the dead from rising. What we now call a monster once began as a question. What if the darkness remembers us? This is the journey into the supernatural origins of humanity's oldest fear. Since ancient times, long before writing, before history, humans walked through the dark, carrying a fear so old that we still feel echoes of it today. It's that shiver along your spine when night falls, when every tiny sound suddenly resembles footsteps approaching from behind. Our ancestors had no electric lights, no science to explain death, disease, or the strange things that happened after sunset. So they filled the void with stories. And from those stories, the earliest silhouette of the vampire was born. In the dark, the most terrifying thing isn't what we see, it's what we don't. The sick coughing through endless nights, the unexplained wasting away of the living, the cold bodies that somehow felt not entirely gone. None of this made sense. When a person grew gaunt, pale, their breath fading, their family had no concept of bacteria or viruses. They only knew that someone or something was draining the life out of them. From that confusion, 3 primal fears took root and never left us. First, the fear of darkness, where every threat is invisible, yet always near. Second, the fear of being hunted, a memory from the age when humans were the weakest creatures in a world full of predators. And finally, the fear of the restless dead, the idea that a loved one could return, but no longer be themselves. These fears converged like streams joining into a single roaring river, shaping the earliest form of a creature we now call the vampire, a being that moves through the night, standing silently beside a sleeping human, stealing life with a touch, a breath, a stare through the window, a monster not born from nature, but from the human mind where darkness and imagination meet. The most unsettling part? Those ancient fears never died. We still dislike rooms that are too quiet. We still freeze at noises with no clear source. And deep down, we still wonder, if darkness had a face, what would it look like? Our ancestors answered that question by inventing the vampire. And to understand why versions of it appeared everywhere on Earth, we must begin where fear first became myth. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of the demons that fed on human life. When we travel back to the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of humanity's first cities, we find a name whispered across ancient clay tablets: Lilitu. She is one of the earliest shadows of a blood-drinking monster in human history. But Lilitu wasn't a demon in the modern sense. She was loneliness given form, a vessel for humanity's helplessness in the face of inexplicable loss. The Sumerians lived in a world where infants might die overnight, where a pregnant woman could bleed out and vanish from her family's future in a matter of hours. and no one knew why. There was no medicine, no explanation, only the silence of the night. Into that silence they placed Lilitu, a wandering female spirit who belonged nowhere, welcomed by no one, and unable to bear children of her own. She envied the life she could never have, and so she slipped into the sleep of mortals to steal what was most precious to them. In the stories passed down through generations, Lilitu arrives like a cold draft seeping through a door crack. They said that if a woman in labor suddenly felt suffocated, or if a child screamed at midnight and then fell still without reason, it meant Lilitu had drifted through. No claws, no fangs. Lilitu did not attack with force, she attacked with absence. She drained breath, vitality, life itself. This invisible form of feeding is the seed of the vampire myth. But behind this supernatural terror lies a far more human truth. The Sumerians had no understanding of premature birth, miscarriage, or sudden infant death. They needed a story to hold their grief, and Lilitu became both an explanation and a strange kind of comfort. It wasn't our fault. Something beyond us took the child. Amulets, incantations, and clay tablet prayers weren't only protections, they were ways to dull the ache of loss. And in that intersection of fear and sorrow, the first outline of the vampire was etched into human memory. Not a castle-dwelling aristocrat like Dracula, but a spirit drifting through darkness, wearing the face of grief. Lilitu teaches us something vital. The vampire did not begin as a creature of evil. It began as the embodiment of pain no one could explain, a name for the suffering humans couldn't bear alone. And from her faint silhouette, a far more terrifying being would emerge, one who drank the blood of infants with hunger and envy alike. Lamashtu. If Lilitu was the ghost of loneliness, then Lamashtu was the nightmare of chaos. As we journey deeper into Mesopotamian myth, we meet a being no longer a mere spirit, but a true monster. A lion's head, donkey's teeth, demonic claws, and a hunger that nothing could ever satisfy. If Lilitu drifted through the night like a cold whisper, Lamashtu walked straight through the door, entering a home like a predator that had already chosen its prey. The Mesopotamians believed Lamashtu didn't just resent life, she craved it. Her targets were the most fragile beings in the ancient world, pregnant women and newborn infants. When a baby was born weak, or a mother bled to death after childbirth, no one understood why. In that helplessness, they said, Lamashtu has entered the house. Legends describe her standing beside an infant's cradle, her eyes wide and shining like those of a wild animal. She would reach down, lift the baby as if holding a tiny bird, and drink its blood, which the Mesopotamians believed was the very root of the soul. To them, blood was not just life, it was essence. So Lamashtu's blood drinking was more than violence. It was a violation of the sacred boundary between mortals and the divine. But what made Lamashtu truly terrifying wasn't her appearance or even her actions. It was her loss of control. Texts portray her as a being consumed by her own hunger. The more she fed, the more ravenous she became. The more she harmed, the less she could stop. She did not think. She did not choose. She acted only on instinct. And for the first time in human mythology, we see the birth of a new idea, the endless, unstoppable hunger, the very heart of the vampire myth. Why did ancient people believe this so deeply? Because they lived with tragedies we rarely face today. Infants dying without explanation, women perishing during childbirth, entire households struck by sickness no one understood. They needed someone to blame, and so they blamed a roaming, frenzied goddess of the night. The amulets, the bronze plaques showing Lamashtu bound in chains, the prayers carved into clay tablets. These were not only protections, they were ways for people to feel they still had some control in a world ruled by danger. Lamashtu wasn't merely a monster. She was the first embodiment of a bloodthirst that never ends, the primal instinct that would later define the vampire. And as that fear grew, a darker question emerged. If a spirit can drink blood, What happens when the dead themselves refuse to stay buried? That question leads us to the next creature, the Ekimmu, those who rise from death to collect the debts of the living. Leaving Mesopotamia for ancient Egypt, we no longer meet vague spirits drifting through the night. Here, fear wears armor. Darkness takes the form of a war goddess, Sekhmet. If Lilitu was a cold wind, and Lamashtu, an invisible hunger, then Sekhmet was a storm of blood the moment humanity confronted the most terrifying truth of all, the violence that lives inside us. According to the myth recorded in the Book of the Heavenly Cow, when humankind rebelled against the god Ra, he didn't punish them with thunder or floods. Instead, he sent his eye, and that eye became Sekhmet, lion-headed, fire-eyed, her breath as searing as the desert. She descended upon humanity like a hunger thousands of years old. Every step she took brought death. Every roar shattered the courage of soldiers. This was more than myth, it was Egypt's vision of cosmic collapse, when the world itself turned into a battlefield. But what made Sekhmet truly terrifying wasn't that she killed, it was that she began to enjoy it. The story says that once Sekhmet tasted human blood, she became intoxicated. The slaughter was no longer Ra's command, it was her desire. Humanity fled, and Sekhmet smiled. A smile stained with red. This was the first moment in human myth where we see the idea. Bloodlust can become addiction, and with that, another window into the vampire myth swung open. When Ra realized Sekhmet had lost control, even he panicked. No god could overpower her, she was pure force. So they tricked her. They dyed beer crimson and poured it across the land like a lake of blood. Sekhmet drank it, mistaking it for the real thing, and drank until she collapsed. When she awoke, she had transformed into her gentler form, Hathor, the goddess of love. But the psychological scar left on humanity didn't fade. Sekhmet taught them, even a god can lose themselves to hunger. And if a deity can be consumed by instinct, what hope does a human have? Future vampire myths would inherit this exact fear. The seduction of hunger, the danger of losing one's humanity, the truth that evil often begins with a single moment of surrender. Sekhmet isn't merely a story about blood. She's a warning that the real monster isn't always outside. It's the one that can awaken within us. And from that fear, the ancient world stepped into an even darker shape. A spirit whose unburied dead returned to claim what was taken from them. The Ekimmu, the restless hunger of a death left unfinished. If Sekhmet embodied the fear of losing control of oneself, then the Ekimmu embodied the fear of losing someone you love, in the most literal way possible. In the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, the Ekimmu wasn't a fanged monster or a night-stalking demon. He was the spirit of a real person, someone who once lived, once had a name, a family, a story, but was never given a proper passage into the afterlife. Because of that neglect, he came back. The Mesopotamians believed death was not an ending. For the soul to rest, the living had to perform the sacred rites, cleansing the body, praying, burying it, and most importantly, remembering. If any of these duties were ignored, the soul became trapped between worlds, unable to move on and unable to return. It became an Ekimmu, a thin, hungry shadow, craving not blood, but life itself. Ancient texts describe the Ekimmu as a cold wind slipping through the doorway, as a rasping breath in the middle of the night. He did not attack with force. He simply stood beside the living and placed an invisible hand upon their chest, draining whatever warmth remained. Those touched by an Ekimmu grew pale, weak, coughing symptoms we now recognize as infectious disease. But to the ancients, it was the hand of the dead. The most frightening part? The Ekimmu was human enough to make people ask, if we forget the dead, will they come back? Like all great myths, the Ekimmu held a mirror to ordinary fears. Fear of failing one's duties, fear of a loved one dying alone, fear that our own neglect might summon tragedy. In some stories, the Ekimmu didn't just drain life. He haunted the household livestock dying suddenly, wells going dry, crops withering. A restless soul could unsettle an entire community. And here, the vampire myth undergoes its next major evolution. The dead themselves become a danger to the living. Not a goddess, not a demon, not a predator, a corpse whose death was incomplete, a revenant returning to settle its unfinished business. From the Akimmu, this idea spread across cultures. Death doesn't close the story. If the order is broken, the dead will rise. And in the Far East, that belief took on a form even more chilling, a stiff corpse hopping through the night, draining the vital breath of the living. This is the Jiangshi, East Asia's haunting vision of the restless dead. As our journey leaves the Middle East and enters the distant East, we encounter one of Asia's most striking supernatural figures, the Jiangshi, the hopping corpse. If the Akimmu was a trapped soul, the Jiangshi was a trapped body, stiff, cold, unyielding, yet still moving through the night in rigid, jerking hops that sent chills down anyone who witnessed them. The Jiangshi did not emerge from pure imagination. It arose from ancient Chinese beliefs that every person possessed multiple souls. If funeral rites were performed incorrectly, one of those souls might fail to leave the body. When that happened, the corpse did not decay as expected. Its joints stiffened, its skin turned pale green, and the body stood upright, motionless until darkness fell. In legend, the Jiangshi sought out the living to consume their qi, the life energy essential to existence. It didn't roar or pounce like an animal. It simply approached, leaned its corpse-pale face close to yours, and siphoned away your breath as though drinking life straight from your lungs. Victims didn't die instantly. They weakened slowly, sleeping endlessly, gasping for breath, growing pale. Today we would recognize these as signs of infectious disease. To ancient eyes, they were the unmistakable mark of a corpse feeding on the living. What made the Jiangshi particularly terrifying was its movement. Because its joints were locked, it couldn't walk. It hopped, arms stretched forward for balance. The thud, thud, thud of its stiff legs striking the ground in an otherwise silent night became a whispered warning. If you hear it, run. But running in the dark was never simple. These stories revealed more than fear of the dead. They revealed the fear of fast-spreading disease, which had repeatedly devastated ancient China. One sick person in a household could doom an entire family. People stared into rooms filled with sickness and whispered, "Something is draining their life." Like many revenants around the world, the Jiangshi wasn't only feared, it was regulated. Ancient Chinese folklore insisted that the corpse feared sticky rice, feared tiny bells, feared a Taoist talisman pressed to its forehead. These rules reflected a deep human need. If we can define the threat, we can survive it. Just like the anti-strigoi rituals of the Balkans or the amulets against Lilitu and Lamashtu, the Jiangshi myth shows how people cling to control amid chaos. The Jiangshi doesn't drink blood, it doesn't speak, it doesn't chase, it only hops, yet each hop brings terror closer. And from that chilling image rises a question echoed across countless cultures. What happens when the dead refuse to stay dead? Ancient India answered with one of the most haunting revenants of all, the Vitala, an upside-down dwelling spirit, cunning and eloquent, always ready to slip into a corpse and test the living. Leaving China for the vast world of ancient India, we meet a creature unlike anything before. If the Jiangshi was a rigid corpse forced into motion, then the Vitala was a free and conscious spirit, intelligent, calculating, and dangerous in an entirely different way. The Vitala doesn't just return from death. It understands death, and sometimes it understands the living far better than we understand ourselves. In Indian thought, certain wandering spirits roam the cremation grounds, unable to join either the world of the living or the realms beyond. These souls seek shelter in corpses left unburned or improperly consecrated. When a Vitala enters such a body, it rises not as a mindless zombie, but as a puppet animated by a sharp and cunning intelligence. The most iconic image of the Vitala is its form hanging upside down from a tree in a cremation ground, eyes wide open, as if waiting for anyone bold or foolish enough to approach. People passing by didn't fear the dead body itself. They feared the gaze of something inside it, something that saw through them, unlike the Jiangshi who drains qi, or the Ekimu who drains life. The Vitala attacks not with force but with the mind. In Kathasarit-Sagara, the ancient Indian story collection, King Vikramaditya must carry a corpse possessed by a Vitala on his back. The Vitala challenges him with riddles, moral paradoxes, and stories designed to test the limits of human understanding. If the king answers, the Vitala escapes back to its tree, forcing him to start over. If he remains silent, the Vitala stays. But that silence itself becomes the trial. This marks a turning point in the evolution of the vampire myth. For the first time, the dead are not just predators, they are psychological strategists. The Vitala terrifies us, not through brute force, but through something far more intimate, the coldness of emotionless intellect, a corpse that knows every secret you've tried to hide, a spirit that perceives the weaknesses you won't admit even to yourself. Like the creatures before it, the Vitala reflects real cultural anxieties, ritual impurity, the fragile boundary between life and death, and the danger of incomplete funerary rites. But it also reveals something deeper, the fear of knowledge without compassion, the fear that something might know too much about us. This idea becomes central to the modern vampire. Dracula doesn't just overpower, he understands. The Vitala shows us that sometimes the most terrifying monster isn't the one that rushes at you, but the one that sits quietly in the dark and smiles because it already knows the ending. But the journey of the blood-drinking shadow doesn't end in India. Crossing into Africa, we encounter creatures shaped by a different fear entirely. The fear of the predator who wears a familiar face, Oifo and Asambosam. Crossing into Africa, especially among the Ashanti people of what is now Ghana, the story of life-draining creatures changes shape once again. If the Vitala was intelligence inhabiting a corpse, then Oifo and Asambosam warn us of something far more unsettling. Sometimes the monster doesn't come from the spirit world. Sometimes it comes from your own community, even from someone you love. The Oifo is neither wandering ghost nor risen corpse. Legend says the Oifo is a living person, an ordinary member of the village by day, but at night, their spirit slips out of their body, soaring through the darkness as a glowing red spark darting between treetops. They seek infants and the vulnerable, feeding by drinking blood or draining life force. By morning, they return to their body, waking as if nothing happened, no one knowing what their soul did while they slept. The Oifo emerged from a very real fear. Children falling mysteriously ill, growing thin, pale, unable to eat, without science to explain disease. Communities created stories to protect themselves. And what could be more terrifying than the idea that the threat isn't a beast in the forest, but the neighbor you greet every morning? This introduces one of the core traits of the vampire myth, the betrayal of the familiar, a predator hiding beneath a human face. Later, Dracula would inherit this perfectly. The charming gentleman who enters your home with a smile and conceals an unending hunger beneath polished manners. If the Oifo represents the fear that someone close might become a monster, then Asambosam represents the opposite fear, the terror of the ancient forest, the place untouched by light. Asambosam is described as a large, red-skinned creature with iron hooks for feet. It hangs from high branches, silently waiting. When someone unknowingly walks beneath its perch, Asambosam drops its hooks, snatches the victim upward, and devours them with iron teeth. Unlike the Oifo, Asambosam does not hide. He is the reminder of nature's brutality, of the darkness, just one step beyond the firelight. Yet both creatures share the defining trait found across cultures. They consume life to continue their own, a universal law at the heart of every vampire myth. Ashanti lore captures two of humanity's oldest fears: the darkness outside something hanging in the trees, waiting for you. The darkness inside the thought that someone you trust might be the one who harms you. O-Ifo is evil wearing a familiar smile. A Sunbosom is evil lurking in the wild. And together, they show us. A vampire is not just the undead. A vampire is anything that shatters our trust in the world and in one another. From Africa, this river of myth carries us to a civilization where life and death intertwine in tragedy. Ancient Mesoamerica. There, from the grief of mothers and the liminality of death, arose a being both sacred and terrifying. They called her Cihuateteo. As our journey crosses the ocean into the land of the ancient Aztecs, the story of life-draining beings transforms once again. No longer the cold, wandering spirits like the Ekimu, nor the hidden predators like the O-Ifo. Here we meet Cihuateteo, one of the most sacred, sorrowful, and frightening figures in the entire history of monster lore. And unlike the creatures we've seen before, the terror of Cihuateteo does not come from malice. It comes from grief. In Aztec society, a woman who died in childbirth was honored as a warrior. She fought in the greatest battle a human could face, the battle between life and death. But the violence and suddenness of that death meant her spirit could not leave the mortal world gently. She returned, not as an angel, but as a demon goddess, a Cihuateteo, a mother bound forever between sanctity and despair. According to legend, the Cihuateteo appeared on 5 specific days of the Aztec calendar, days considered unlucky, when the boundary between the living and the dead cracked open. They wandered the crossroads, hair disheveled, eyes white, faces half human and half skull. In the darkness, they sought children and the vulnerable, bringing seizures, sickness, and sometimes stealing the souls of the living to carry back to their shadowed realm. But what makes the Cihuateteo frightening is not their actions. It is the origin of their hunger. They do not harm out of evil. They harm out of sorrow. Aztec women who died in childbirth often lost their infants too. They lost their families, their futures, and the life they fought to bring into the world. In that shattering grief, people imagined their spirits becoming jealous of other mothers, other children, and thus was born the image of a demon goddess stealing infants and spreading illness. Just like Lamia in Greece, or Lilitu in Mesopotamia, the Cihuateteo reveal a painful truth in the history of vampires. Many life-draining monsters were born from the grief of women who lost their children. It is a sorrow too immense to explain, so humanity transformed it into myth. The Cihuateteo embody 2 parallel fears: the fear of losing a loved one, and the fear of being pulled into the grief of those who already have. Aztec mythology adds an essential new piece to the vampire's evolution: the idea of the dead returning out of envy for the living, a theme that will echo through Strigoi, through European revenants, and ultimately through Dracula himself, a creature unable to bear the warmth of a life he no longer possesses. From the blazing world of the Aztecs, the path of the vampire leads to a land of philosophy and tragedy. Ancient Greece. There, another myth was born, and for the first time, the monster appears with a broken heart. Her name was Lamia. Entering the world of ancient Greece, a civilization that worshipped reason, beauty, and philosophy, you might expect supernatural horrors to fade away. But instead, in this land of logic and poetry, one of the most heartbreaking legends in vampire history took shape. The story of Lamia, the creature who marks a crucial turning point in the evolution of the vampire myth, the first monster born from a broken heart. Before she became the terror of Greek children, Lamia was a beautiful queen of Libya. She wasn't a demon, she wasn't a spirit. She was human until the gods destroyed her. Zeus loved her, and as in every Greek tragedy, his love meant Hera's rage. In her fury, Hera committed the cruelest act imaginable. She killed Lamia's children, No ancient text can fully convey the depth of Lamia's grief, because no language can. The Greeks said Hera cursed her so she could never close her eyes, forcing her to watch the death of her children forever, their last moments replaying endlessly like a wound that would not heal. Her sorrow twisted her beauty into a distorted grin, reshaped her lower body into a serpent's tail, and transformed a mother's heart into a hunger for children. Lamia did not kill out of malice. She killed because she had lost her mind in grief. And in this tragedy, we see an idea that would become essential to vampire mythology: the jealousy of the dead toward the living. Just as Lilitu envied fertility thousands of years earlier, Lamia envied the mothers who still held their children. Her envy became hunger, a spiritual hunger, before it ever became a physical one. But Lamia's story is also a mirror reflecting Greek society's fears about women: the grieving woman dangerous, the aging woman frightening, the desiring woman capable of luring and killing men. From here, the vampire myth absorbed a new element: deadly seduction. Some versions say Lamia could shift back into a beautiful woman to lure men before devouring them. This is the seed of the seductive female vampire archetype, found later in Carmilla, in Dracula, and throughout Gothic literature. Lamia matters because she shattered the idea of the monster as a mindless beast. For the first time in the 4,000-year journey of the vampire, humans looked at a terrifying creature and saw pain they understood. And when a monster inspires sympathy, it becomes far more dangerous. It no longer lives in forests or graveyards. It lives inside our own sorrow. From Greece, that fear spread to Rome, and there, another creature emerged, one with no heartbreak, no humanity, only hunger and ruthless predation: the Strix, the direct ancestor of the Strigoi and the European vampire. If Lamia was the tragedy that made humans see the monster's pain, then in the Roman world, all empathy vanished. Here, there was no sorrow, no divine curse, no broken heart, only hunger, instinct, and the raw brutality of a creature born to prey. That creature was the Strix, and from its name, the world would later form the word Strigoi, the foundation of the Eastern European vampire. In Roman literature, especially in the writings of Ovid, the Strix appears as a witch-like nightbird, often resembling an owl, huge eyes blazing in the dark, talons sharp as knives, a shrill cry so uncanny it felt like something was hovering just outside the window. But the most terrifying part of the Strix wasn't its shape, it was its chosen prey: newborns. The Strix waited until a household fell asleep, then slipped through windows or vents, descending upon the cradle. With its long, needle-sharp beak, it pierced the child's skin and drank its blood, leaving the tiny body pale and empty. No jealousy like Lamia, no sorrow like Lilitu, only appetite. The Strix was a pure monster, never human, never sympathetic, never tragic. It existed to do one thing: feed, and that single, merciless instinct made it the perfect blueprint for the vampires of Europe. It provided the most frightening answer to the question, why did something terrible happen? Leven rive her, because the darkness wanted it. The Romans feared more than just the Strix's hunger. They believed it could shapeshift, appearing as a monstrous bird, a haggard witch, or an uncanny half-bird, half-woman. More disturbingly, they believed the Strix fed on youth itself, a concept that would later reappear in Eastern European folklore, where the Strigoi weakened the living day by day, as if draining vitality from the inside. To ward off the Strix, the Romans performed strange rituals: hawthorn branches placed around the home, garlic hung at the door, salt scattered across thresholds, offerings laid out at night. Centuries later, these exact practices would reappear, almost unchanged, in Romanian villages fighting the Strigoi. This is the direct bridge between the ancient Mediterranean and the vampire of Europe. One thing stands out: the Strix has no human face, no emotion, no backstory. And that emptiness is precisely what made it horrifying to Roman imagination. Humans can understand grief. We can sympathize with loss. But how do you comprehend a creature that comes in the night simply to drain blood, then vanishes? In the evolution of the vampire, the Strix marks a decisive shift. From tragedy to pure animal instinct, from metaphor to visceral horror, from wandering soul to predator. And from this ancient nightbird, the path leads straight toward the Strigoi of the Balkans. But before Eastern Europe fully shapes the vampire we know today, one more creature of the Greco-Roman world must step forward: Empusa, the shape-shifting demoness who seduced men and drank their blood, combining the predator's appetite with the lethal danger of beauty. If the Roman Strix embodied pure animal instinct, then Empusa of the Greco-Roman world opened an entirely new door in the evolution of the vampire. The idea of beauty as a weapon. For the first time in monster history, seduction itself became a form of attack, and it would become one of the central pillars of the modern vampire. Empusa was said to be the daughter of Hecate, goddess of magic and night. Unlike earlier grotesque monsters, Empusa often appeared as a stunningly beautiful young woman. But that beauty was only a disguise. Behind it lurked something uncanny. One leg of bronze, the other a donkey's hoof. In darkness, she could shapeshift, hiding her monstrous lower half, keeping only the face and figure capable of stopping any man in his tracks. And so, a new archetype was born, the monster who attacks not with claws, but with a glance. Greek stories tell of Empusa appearing on lonely roads, where men traveled exhausted and unguarded. She would call to them with a voice soft as silk, draw them into intimate conversation, and slowly guide them into her embrace. But once they lay in her arms, she revealed her gleaming teeth, eyes burning like coals, and drank their blood, leaving behind only a shriveled corpse. Empusa was a turning point because she fused three seemingly contradictory traits: seduction, danger, and unending hunger. For the first time in myth, death wore the face of desire, and that made it far more terrifying than any beast with claws. Empusa also reflected Greek fears surrounding women, especially those who were independent, beautiful, or unwilling to obey societal expectations. Such women were mysterious, powerful, and therefore, within the patriarchal lens, dangerous. Many scholars believe Empusa functioned as a warning to young men. Do not let desire blind you. To the Greeks, desire itself could be a demon, and from this moment forward, the vampire myth gained a new skin: deadly allure, the predator who is invited into your life, the monster you fear and yet cannot resist. Empusa completes the emotional trinity of Greco-Roman monsters: Lamia, sorrow; Strix, instinct; Empusa, desire. Together, they shaped the emotional DNA of the European vampire, a creature that is pitiful, horrific, and irresistibly alluring. But when the Roman Empire fell, and Europe plunged into the disease-ridden shadows of the Middle Ages, a new horror emerged, one far more terrifying than any Greek demon. It wasn't a god, it wasn't a witch, it was a real corpse, belonging to someone who lived in the village, now rising from the grave and spreading sickness through the entire community. This was the revenant, the being that laid the first stones on the road leading directly to the Eastern European vampire. As we enter medieval Europe, mythology gives way to something far more unnerving, a monster not born from gods or curses, but from ordinary people, no longer spirits drifting in the night, no longer seductive demons or shape-shifting witches. This was the terror of someone you knew, a neighbor, a family member, someone buried days earlier, now rising from the grave and spreading sickness through the community. The medieval Europeans called this creature a simple, chilling name: the revenant, the one who returns. The clearest accounts come from William of Newburgh, a 12th century historian who insisted he was not writing folklore, but recording truth from credible witnesses. He described a case in Buckinghamshire A dead man seen wandering outside his home at night, knocking on doors, moaning, disturbing the entire village. The people, already terrified of outbreaks, saw this as a sign, and indeed, a deadly plague soon swept through the region. To medieval minds, this was not coincidence. The dead carried disease. It was the only explanation they had. Remember, this was Europe before germ theory. When one person died of illness and those around them soon followed, people did not understand contagion. But they noticed a pattern. One death seemed to open a door for many. From that fear, the revenant myth took shape. The dead are draining life from the living. William described even worse cases. In Berwick, a revenant supposedly clawed its way out of the grave each night, visiting homes, terrifying families, and heralding a wave of sickness that devastated the town. The villagers were so horrified they didn't wait for church permission. They exhumed the corpse, decapitated it, and burned the remains. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is nearly identical to the anti-strigoi rituals of Romania centuries later. A crucial truth emerges. The revenant was not a demon, not a spirit, not a mythic creature from faraway lands. It was a real corpse, believed to be the source of a very real epidemic. This marks a major turning point in the evolution of the vampire. The vampire becomes a public health crisis. One person's death can endanger the entire community. Exhumation, decapitation, burning becomes a medieval decontamination method. Here, we see the early structure of vampiric logic. A corpse that doesn't decay, normally suspicious. A corpse seen walking contagious stuff. Only fire stops the threat. These ideas would later become standard features in Eastern European vampire lore. The medieval revenant dragged the vampire myth out of the world of Greco-Roman fantasy and dropped it into the everyday lives of European villagers. No longer a creature from distant lands, but the corpse of someone you once knew, rising from the grave and terrifying the entire town. But in the icy north, the fear grew even more monstrous. There, not just the soul, and not just disease, but the body itself could become a massive, blue-black horror, a creature strong as an ox, crushing anyone who approached its burial mound. This was the Draugr, the undead giant of the Vikings. As our journey drifts into the icy north, we enter the land of the Vikings, a world where death was not the end, but a terrifying continuation of strength, greed, and rage. Here we meet the Draugr, the creature that marks a critical turning point in the evolution of the vampire. The monster is no longer a spirit, nor a witch, nor a wandering soul. It is a corpse powerful, physical, and unwilling to let go of the world. In the Norse sagas, the Draugr is often a man who, in life, was cruel, greedy, or consumed by ambition. At death, his body does not decay. Instead, it swells grotesquely. His skin turns a blue-black hue, like a body drowned in frozen seawater, and a foul stench rises from the flesh, a sign the Vikings interpreted as rotting life, still trapped inside. But the most terrifying part, his will does not die with his body. The Draugr rises from its burial mound, usually a large cairn filled with gold, weapons, and valuables. Bound by obsession with wealth, status, or vengeance, it continues to guard its tomb, as though still alive. Anyone who approaches, whether to steal treasure or simply pass by, faces a creature with the strength of an ox. Many sagas describe Draugr crushing bones with bare hands, throwing warriors to the ground, or sitting on victims' chests until they suffocate. The Draugr does not drink blood. It does not drain breath. It crushes life with brute force and the enormity of its undead presence. This reflects a uniquely Viking fear, the terror of evil ancestors returning to torment the living. If a man was too wicked, too greedy, or died with unresolved hatred, he might not rest, and his family would pay the price. Many tales describe Draugr leaving their mound to visit their old homes, standing outside all night, suffocating the air itself, killing livestock, damaging property and driving families into madness. This marks a turning point that brings the vampire closer to its modern form, a physical monster capable of real attack, a corpse that does not decay, supernatural strength, malice carried from life into death. Compared to the medieval revenant, the Draugr is an evolution. The revenant spreads disease. The Draugr spreads violence. And in many sagas, the only way to end a Draugr is through the familiar ritual. Stab the chest, cut off the head, and burn the remains. The exact same method Slavic villages would later use against the Strigoi. The Draugr proves something crucial. Vampire myths were not born only from fears of the soul, but also from fears of terrible people whose evil could not be buried. And when this fear traveled south, into the shadowed forests and rugged mountains of the Balkans, all these threads finally wove together into the vampire the entire world would come to recognize: the Strigoi, the creature that marks the shift from myth to lived history, from folklore to recorded panic. Leaving the frozen lands of the Vikings, the path of the life-draining monster leads us to a place where every ancient fear, disease, restless corpses, wandering souls, insatiable hunger, fuses into a single terrifying form: the Strigoi of the Balkans and Romania. This isn't just another creature of folklore. This is the keystone of vampire evolution, the closest, clearest ancestor of the vampire we know today. In Romanian belief, every human has two souls, one tied to the body, the other able to wander during dreams. If someone died with their spirit, unsettled, because of anger, improper burial, or ritual mistakes, that wandering soul would not leave this world. Instead, it returned, slipped back into the corpse, and transformed the dead into a Strigoi. Unlike the massive Draugr, the Strigoi often looked perfectly human, but that human appearance was only camouflage. Balkan folklore says a Strigoi could leave its grave by night, drink human blood or drain life essence, leaving people pale and hollow, feed on livers, hearts, or even the milk of livestock, weaken herds and blight crops, spread misfortune like an invisible plague. The Strigoi didn't just hunt people, it hunted the entire village's livelihood. This reflects the harsh reality of the Balkans. Illness, famine, and failed harvests were constant threats. Crucially, Balkan tradition divides them into two terrifying types: Strigoi vii, the living Strigoi, a living person with a wicked soul that wanders at night to cause harm; Strigoi mort, the dead Strigoi, a corpse that refuses to rest, returning in its own physical body. This duality makes the Strigoi uniquely frightening. Anyone could be the monster: your neighbor, your child, even you. Here, the vampire becomes most dangerous, the predator hiding beneath a human face. To fight Strigoi, Balkan villagers developed an entire system of practical rituals: nailing the coffin shut, sewing needles into the clothing of the dead to pin down the soul, stuffing garlic into the corpse's mouth, placing hawthorn branches around the grave, and the ultimate ritual: exhumation, staking, decapitation, burning to ash. These weren't stories. These were real practices, documented by ethnographers and later copied directly into modern vampire fiction. Strigoi is the final, fully formed prototype before the vampire enters recorded history. And what sets the Strigoi apart? This is the first creature in our entire journey that people believed in so strongly. They reported it to the authorities. Only a few decades later, Europe would witness two chilling events: real exhumations, real medical reports, and real undecomposed bodies at the center of public panic. The cases of Petar Blagojevich and Arnold Paule, where the Strigoi collided head-on with the Habsburg Empire, and the word vampire entered official European documents for the first time. That is the next step in the story, when Balkan folklore became history and the modern vampire was born. If the Strigoi lived for centuries in Balkan imagination, then Petar Blagojevich was the moment that imagination erupted into history. This was the first time a European government was forced to file an official report about a vampire. No longer a fireside story, no longer a village superstition. This was the moment vampire became an administrative problem. The story begins in 1725, in the small border village of Kisilova, modern Serbia, newly absorbed into the Habsburg Empire. Petar Blagojevich, a completely ordinary farmer, died and was buried according to local customs. But only 10 days after his death, panic exploded. 9 more villagers died in the same terrifying way. They hadn't been wounded. They hadn't starved. They claimed Petar visited them in the night, sat on their chests, and sucked their life away. To the Balkan villagers, this was a textbook Strigoi attack. To an Austrian imperial official, it was unthinkable. The panic escalated when Blagojevich's widow fled the village, swearing her dead husband had come home and demanded his shoes. For the villagers, this was undeniable proof. Petar had become a vampire. When they demanded the grave be opened, the local Habsburg administrator, Johann Frombold, refused. He was a man of law and logic, not folklore, but the villagers threatened to abandon the settlement or take violent action. Fearing a revolt, Frombold relented and documented everything in a meticulous report. What they found when they opened the grave shocked even him. The corpse had not decomposed, despite being buried for days. Fresh skin seemed to have grown beneath the old. Nails and beard looked longer, a normal post-mortem illusion caused by shrinking skin. Most disturbing of all, fresh, bright blood around the mouth. Today we recognize these as natural effects of post-mortem chemistry in cold, sealed coffins. But to an 18th century Balkan villager, this was irrefutable evidence. Petar had risen and fed on the living. Following tradition, they drove a stake through his chest. Frombold's report records that when the stake pierced the body, a great quantity of fresh blood spurted forth, terrifying everyone present. The villagers then burned the body, the final ritual to break the Strigoi's curse. Frombold forwarded the report to Vienna, adding a nervous disclaimer: he was only trying to maintain order and should not be blamed for local superstition. What he didn't expect was this. His report became the first official vampire document in European history. It was copied, distributed, and read across the continent. And for the first time, a Serbian village word vampire entered the political language of Europe, laying the foundation for the global word vampire. But this was only the beginning. Just a few years later, an even bigger, more complex, and more terrifying case erupted. The case of Arnold Pauli, where people believed vampirism could spread through livestock, forcing the Habsburg Empire to send its top imperial medical corps to investigate. That is the next chapter of this story. If the case of Petar Blagojevich was the spark that introduced Europe to the word vampire, then the case of Arnold Pauli was the wildfire. This wasn't just a story of the dead rising. This was the first time in history people believed vampirism could spread, like an epidemic. And that belief forced one of Europe's most powerful empires to dispatch its highest medical authorities. The story begins in the village of Meduegna, not far from Kisilova, the site of Blagojevich's terror a few years earlier. Arnold Pauli, a former soldier who had served in Ottoman territories, returned home with a chilling confession. He claimed he had once been attacked by a vampire in Greece. But Pauli insisted he had cured the curse by finding the creature's grave, eating some of its dirt, and smearing its blood on his body. A local Balkan method believed to break a vampire's influence. 3 years later, Pauli died in a mundane accident falling from a hay wagon. He was buried like anyone else. But only 1 month later, a wave of terror swept the village. People reported seeing Pauli standing in the darkness, moving between houses, or sitting on their chests at night. Within weeks, 4 villagers died, all showing the same symptoms: weakness, suffocation, bluish skin. None could explain their condition, but all whispered the same final words: Paolo was here. The villagers unearthed his body. What they found mirrored the Blagojevich case exactly. Paoli's corpse had not decomposed. Fresh skin under the old, bright blood around the mouth, and when they drove a stake through his chest, a fountain of red blood burst out. They burned the body, believing the curse was over. It wasn't. Villagers believed Paolo, before being cured, had attacked local cattle, and according to Balkan belief, anyone who ate meat from an animal bitten by a vampire could become infected. In modern terms, this was a folklore version of zoonotic transmission. Sure enough, over the next few years, 17 more people died mysteriously. The same wasting symptoms, the same breathless nights, the same pale, drained faces. The village collapsed into panic. They believed Paoli's second generation of vampires had emerged, creatures not turned by Paolo directly, but by contaminated food. The fear grew so overwhelming that local officials could no longer contain it. Reports were sent to Vienna, and this time, the Habsburg court did not ignore the crisis. They launched a formal investigation led by Johannes Flückiger, a senior imperial military surgeon. When Flückiger arrived in Medunia in the winter of 1731, he found a community paralyzed by dread. Villagers refused to sleep, refused to eat local food, and pointed out graves they insisted contained vampires. The medical team exhumed 13 bodies, and what they found would change European history. Corpses buried for months, still looking intact, liquid blood in the chest cavity, fresh skin, and in several cases, when the stake pierced the heart, blood spurted out as if the body were alive. Flückiger recorded everything in precise, clinical detail. Ironically, this scientific tone didn't calm Europe, it terrified it. His report didn't debunk vampirism, it inadvertently validated it. The Arnold Paoli case directly led the Habsburg Empire to establish laws regulating and forbidding the destruction of suspected vampires. Yet the strangest outcome was this. Although Flückiger tried to stay rational, his report became one of the strongest proofs of vampires in all of Europe. Within months, the story spread like wildfire. From aristocratic dining halls to philosophical salons, to newspapers in London, Paris, and Berlin, everyone spoke of the Serbian vampires. A scientific controversy like nothing before was about to erupt, but before that, we must examine the most important document in the entire vampire timeline, Flückiger's official report, Visum et Repertum, the first time a vampire was described in the cold language of medicine. That will be the story of Part 18. When Johannes Flückiger and the Habsburg Medical Corps arrived in the village of Meduegna in 1731, they had no idea they were about to write one of the strangest documents in European history. A report written in the language of science, describing phenomena that science at the time had no means to explain. This document was titled Visum et Repertum, what was seen and discovered. It was not folklore, not hearsay, not superstition. It was an official legal medical report, signed, sealed, and submitted to the imperial government. And because of that, it shook Europe to its core. During the exhumation, Flückiger and his team examined 13 bodies out of the 17 recent deaths. What they found left even trained military physicians stunned. 1. Many corpses were not decomposing, despite being dead for 1 to 3 months. In a world without refrigeration, preservatives, or microbial science, this was horrifying. These bodies should have been liquefied, collapsed, foul. Instead, they found new skin forming beneath old skin, fingernails and toenails appearing longer, gas buildup swelling the bodies as if they were still alive. 2. Fresh blood inside the chest cavity and around the mouth. Flückiger noted explicitly a great quantity of red, fluid blood in the heart and chest cavity. In several cases, blood was visible around the lips, making it appear as if the corpse had fed. Today, we know slow decomposition in cold conditions can preserve blood in liquid form. But to 18th century Europeans, this was irrefutable evidence. The dead had risen and fed on the living. 3. The groaning phenomenon. Corpses, making sounds when staked. Flückiger described multiple cases where, upon driving a stake through the chest, the corpse emitted a groan. Blood spurted from the mouth and ears. Modern science explains this as compressed post-mortem gases being forced out. But Flückiger didn't know that. He simply recorded what he saw, in calm, clinical language. And that was what terrified Europe most. A scientific report that did not reject the supernatural, but documented it. 4. The destruction ritual entirely according to Balkan tradition. Flückiger didn't interfere. He simply observed as villagers performed their established ritual, removing the corpse from the grave, driving a stake through the heart, decapitating the body, burning it to ash, scattering the remains in the river. He concluded the villagers were too terrified to be persuaded by reason. When Visum et Repertum reached Vienna, it didn't stop there. It was translated into German, copied by newspapers, cited by scientific journals, debated in philosophical salons, and spread across Europe like wildfire. This became the first and only official medical document in European history that seemed to state, vampires exist according to imperial physicians, not gossip, not peasant superstition, not myth. A military medical report written in the cold, neutral tone of clinical observation. The irony? Flückiger never intended to confirm vampires. He tried to remain objective, but that neutrality made his report more convincing than any believer's testimony. The vampire panic exploded. Philosophers debated, doctors argued, governments issued bans on grave exhumations. Europe's first scientific controversy about vampires began. And in the middle of this intellectual storm, one man stepped forward, collected every account, every rumor, every report, and wrote the most important vampire study before Dracula, Dom Augustin Calmet, the monk who became the librarian of demons. As Europe staggered under the vampire hysteria unleashed by Visum et Repertum, someone needed to make sense of it all. The rumors, the reports, the medical notes, the fear. That person wasn't a soldier, nor a doctor, nor a statesman. It was Dom Augustin Calmet, a quiet Benedictine monk, a scholar of scripture, a man devoted to books, not monsters. He wasn't hunting demons, he was hunting clarity, and in doing so, he became the most important figure in vampire history, long before Bram Stoker ever picked up a pen. Calmet lived during the Age of Enlightenment, a time obsessed with science and reason, but at the same time, stories from the Balkans, undecayed corpses, blood flowing from the mouths of the dead, hearts pierced with stakes, were spreading across Paris, Vienna, and beyond. Some people panicked, some laughed. Calmet did neither. He began collecting everything. The result was a monumental work, treatises on the apparitions of spirits, and on vampires or revenants of Hungary, Moravia, etc. In it, Calmet assembled, from Bald's report on Petar Blagojevich, Flückiger's Visum et Repertum, accounts from Eastern Orthodox clergy, Balkan oral traditions, Roman and Greek writings, even ancient Middle Eastern demonology. He mocked nothing, feared nothing. He simply analyzed. The result became the first encyclopedic study of vampires in human history. Calmet offered two sets of arguments. 1. Arguments supporting the existence of vampires. He compiled every official report, every eyewitness, every documented event. He wrote, "One cannot deny that many people have seen what they believe to be vampires." 2. Arguments rejecting their existence. He proposed rational explanations. Burial mistakes, misunderstood stages of decomposition, disease spread through livestock, mass psychological contagion, communal fear spirals. Calmet ultimately concluded, there is not enough evidence to confirm vampires are real. But, and this was the explosive part, he also added, yet I cannot entirely dismiss them. This neutrality made his book a sensation. Believers read it as proof, skeptics read it as ammunition, writers mined it for inspiration, philosophers debated it publicly. Without meaning to, Calmet did something monumental. He transformed the vampire from a Balkan village superstition into a pan-European myth. Before Calmet, vampires lived in remote mountains and border villages. After Calmet, vampires became a topic of philosophy, medicine, theology, and popular culture. And more importantly, his book became the primary source Bram Stoker used 150 years later to build Dracula. Every familiar trait, the stake through the heart, exhumation rituals, undecayed corpses, contagion, ties to plague, Balkan folklore, comes directly from Calmet's work. Dom Calmet didn't believe vampires walked the earth, but he did something no one else dared. He preserved every scrap of vampire lore so the future could inherit it. He didn't create the vampire, but he built the library where it could survive forever. And one man, Bram Stoker, would eventually step into that library and turn a Balkan revenant into an immortal legend. Count Dracula. That is the bridge into the final chapter of our journey. When Dom Calmet closed his monumental tome of strange reports and Balkan terrors, the vampire myth finally possessed every ingredient it needed. Fear of darkness, disease, the restless dead, endless hunger, deadly seduction. But these pieces still floated separately, waiting. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that one man gathered every fragment, forged them together, breathed life into them, and created the most complete monster in human history, Count Dracula. That man was Bram Stoker. What makes Dracula the pinnacle of vampire mythology is not that Stoker invented him, but that he masterfully combined 4 ancestral bloodlines, distilling millennia of fear into a single, immortal figure. The first pillar, history. Stoker borrowed the name Dracula from Vlad III Tsepesh Vlad the Impaler, the ruthless Wallachian prince. Vlad's brutality, discipline, and strategic mind became the backbone of Dracula, not just a monster, but a calculating aristocrat with purpose and power. The second pillar, Balkan folklore, strigoi, revenants, grave rituals, staking, decapitation, burning, transmission through blood, transformation into mist, control of wolves and bats, leaving the coffin only by night. Stoker lifted these elements straight from Calmet and the Habsburg reports. Dracula is, in essence, the ultimate strigoi refined for Western literature. The third pillar, Gothic romance. Drawing from Empusa and later European tales, Stoker gave Dracula something new, seductive danger, a sensuality that frightened and fascinated, a monster who kills not by force, but by invitation. Temptation turned into horror. Dracula became the embodiment of forbidden desire, dark, hypnotic, elegant, fatal. The fourth pillar, Victorian fear. This is what made Dracula immortal. He became the symbol of every anxiety haunting Stoker's era. Fear of blood-borne disease in an age of shifting medical knowledge. Fear of the foreign invader, entering and corrupting British society. Reverse colonization. Fear of women's expanding sexual freedom. Fear of imperial decline. Fear of moral collapse beneath civilization's polished veneer. Dracula wasn't just a monster. He was a living metaphor for everything Victorian society refused to speak aloud. The result was a creature ancient yet modern, sensual yet monstrous, a refined gentleman and a predatory beast, a vampire who could seduce the living, manipulate the night, live eternally through blood, spread disease and curse, conquer hearts without lifting a finger. Dracula is the summit of a 4,000-year evolution. A lineage beginning with Lilitu and Lamashtu, through Sekhmet, Vetala, Jiangxi, Asanbosam, Shiwa-Teteo, Lamia, Strix, Empusa, Revenant, Draugr, and Strigoi. Each contributed a piece, the soul, The body, the hunger, the jealousy, the grief, the seduction, the violence, the plague, the power. Dracula is the synthesis of them all. And the strangest truth is this: though he lives in darkness, Dracula helps humanity see itself more clearly. Because what makes vampires terrifying is not the fangs, nor the cape, but the way they reflect the deepest parts of us. Our fear of losing control, our fear of disease, our fear of being invaded or consumed, our fear of becoming something we don't recognize, our fear of our own desires. Vampires endure because fear endures. Vampires are immortal because human anxieties never die. Bram Stoker didn't create a monster. He simply held up a mirror, and when we look into the darkness behind it, we don't just see Dracula, we see ourselves.